There are two stories told about artists today. One is that it's easier than ever to be an artist because anyone with an internet connection can make content. The second is that consumers have gotten so used to art and entertainment being free that artists have a hard time just earning a middle class living. This book, The Death of the Artist by William Deresiewicz, makes a case for the second scenario. I got to meet William Deresiewicz this summer virtually in Prague, and now I'm finally getting to interview him for this podcast. I asked comedian and TV writer turned novelist Nicholas Anthony to join me for this interview because we had talked a lot about this book on our segment called An Opera Singer and a Comedian Walk into a Bar. So with no further ado, here are two artists interviewing William Deresiewicz, author of Death of the Artist. First of all, yes, thank you for being here. We've had lots of arguments about your book, very fruitful arguments, I think, but ones that it's not really possible to resolve them ultimately. It's that irresolvable argument about big picture versus individual action kind of thing. I think I wanted to just start with a question of what inspired. Why did you feel this book needed to be written when you wrote it, and then what has maybe changed or how things have developed since the publication in 2020?
The book kind of came from a number of places, but probably the most motivating one was my disgust with the bullshit that was being peddled by Silicon Valley and their useful idiots in academia and the media about how this is the greatest time ever to be an artist because you can just put your stuff online and, support yourself. And it was just so obviously, I mean, in some cases stupid and in some cases, I think deeply disingenuous. And I wanted to expose that. I wanted to really kind of put that argument out in a big way. But also, look, I mean, I knew that not only was this not the best time ever financially to be an artist, but it was actually a really bad time. But that made me really curious. Like, people are still making art, and they're even still making a living, or more likely part of a living, making art. Music, writing, visual art, etc. And I wanted to find out, like, how does this actually work?
I mean, one of the things you say, and one of the arguments we've had is hasn't it always been hard? Hasn't it always been hard to be an artist? It's always been a very small. And then I mean, what you argue, at least what you say directly to preempt that in the first chapter is, well, yes, it's always been hard, but it's never been this hard for people that have gotten this far. That is, even the people who are actually quite successful are facing things that they just wouldn't have had to in previous generations. Can you elaborate on that, why that is?
Absolutely. So again, first of all, yes, it's always been hard, although even that is not quite true. I mean, always really just means the last few centuries, but we don't need to go into that. But I mean, there are different degrees of hard. There's hard where, like, you can live the bohemian life, you can live cheaply and make your work by supporting yourself with a part-time minimum wage job, which is how it might have been for a lot of artists in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the 1890s. I think everybody knows that that's not possible anymore. Wages have not kept up with the cost of living, specifically the cost of literal living, of space, of rent, especially in creative cities. And then there's what the internet has done to the other side of the balance sheet, the way, all this money that art used to generate, like music, and actually does still generate, is not going to artists. I mean, a very small fraction of it is going to artists. So the distinction you made is right. There have always been artists who've been just scraping by. They may be young and just starting out. They may not be very good. There are lots of artists like that. They may be highly experimental, so they don't have much of an audience appeal. But I would say, especially before the internet came along, the decades before the internet came along, say from World War II to the end of the century, was actually a very good time for artists to make a living. And if you were moderately successful, not a big star, not a name that everyone's heard or even many people have heard, but just a professional working artist, recognized in your field, producing consistently, having a modicum of success, you could not only survive, but actually live a middle-class life. I mean, not maybe upper middle class, but middle class. You could live okay. And that's just been completely destroyed by the internet.
I mean, is it really just what is unique about this to artists? Isn't this a lot of different professions, and isn't the disappearance of the middle class kind of a theme overall right now in the economy? What's specific to artists here?
Yes. So first of all, yes, and I say at the end of the book, this is true of a lot of middle class occupations. What's specific to artists is that artists create what is now called, in the age of the internet, content, right? That's how we make a living. We produce stuff, and insofar as that stuff can be digitized, which is true of most artists. I mean, if you're a painter selling unique objects, it is different. But again, music, writing, film and television, a lot of kinds of visual art, it all becomes digitized. And digital content, the price of digital content has been driven down to zero or near zero for reasons that no one needs explained to them. So that's probably the biggest thing that distinguishes artists from other kinds of people.
Another thing you say also in the opening chapter is this idea that it's not that art will disappear. People will always make art, but art with a capital A is in danger.
Right.
What do you mean by art with a capital A? What does that mean
Right.
to you?
Right. So without going through the whole historical argument, yes, people have always, sung songs and, told stories, and the cave paintings are tens of thousands of years old. So that impulse is always going to exist. But what people, I think, a lot of times don't understand, and I spend a whole section of the book explaining this, is that art has not always served the same role has not always had the same role in society that we usually take for granted now, because we only know the role that it plays or is supposed to play in our society. So before, about it wasn't a sudden transformation, but before roughly the late 18th century, which not coincidentally is the time of the American Revolution and the French Revolution and a kind of secular revolution, art was subservient to other domains. The artist didn't speak truth to power. The artist wasn't sort of some genius who was, imagining society's way into the future. The artist worked on commission and expressed the meanings that authority, that power wanted them to express. So, I mean, most obviously, the Pope, the church, the king, the aristocracy. Art with a capital A is about a lot of things. This idea that begins to arise in the late 18th century in the age that we call Romanticism. It's about a lot of things, but I think the most important thing it's about is that art now became free. Art freed itself from those forms of financial and ideological subservience. And this has been absolutely central to the way we think about art and what artists do, so much so that it, as I said, probably doesn't occur to us that it could be any different. But for most of human history, it had been different. And the point that I make at length in the book is that ideological freedom was dependent on financial freedom, right? I mean, if everybody knows this, everybody who has a job understands that, you are limited by, the internet is taking away that financial freedom. It's making it impossible to live. So artists are less and less able to say what they want. They're not subservient to church and crown. I think they're subservient to the whims of the mob, of the online mob. And I think we see this everywhere.
Yeah, one place that you said that was a bit of a bastion was was specifically Hollywood in terms of the writing. In the book, you make it seem like it's a bit of a soft landing. I've worked in television for the last decade, and I have my own anecdotal experience that it creates my own bias. Having learned what we learned through the strikes that just happened, would you amend any of the statements that you made about Hollywood specifically in the book?
Right. So what I say in the book is that the one art that is thriving is television, not even movies and television, but specifically television. And again, everybody understands this. There was this golden age of television that really probably dates to The Sopranos in 1999, and all the streaming services that started. I mean, first other networks like FX and AMC started paying a lot of money for original programming. There was wonderful stuff being made, lots of creative freedom. Then the streaming services got in, and Apple and Amazon, and there was, tens of billions of dollars going into television production. And I didn't, what I didn't say was that everything is great and they're all rolling in money, because obviously there's most of the money goes to the stars, but that the typical person working in television, say the typical writer, was at least sustaining a middle class existence, and this seemed to be the one art that was thriving artistically and financially, and therefore artistically. I think I was already beginning to doubt that at the time that I finished writing the book, which was 2019. It's pretty clear at this point that to the extent that was true, and I think that it was, that's not true anymore. And I'm sure, Nick, you know this better than I do.
Well, it's fascinating to me to, just taking my own, stock of my own, you say like, well, maybe I'm, I can be humble enough to say like, well, maybe I'm not talented enough, or maybe I just didn't work hard enough, or what advice do you give people to kind of fetter out, like, is it that it's a macro issue and that we have to look at it as something that's bigger than us? Because I came up doing stand-up where it was so difficult, and it was only because I was able to push through. And maybe it's, when I look back as a white male, I was headlining comedy clubs at a time when it was only white men, and even that has shifted tremendously. And I haven't been doing as much stand-up, but I have to imagine it would be more difficult now, just because of the competition. And I, obviously we support the diversity. I want to see the world I see in the art. But I guess the question is, the types of people that are going to pick up this book are probably people who are frustrated with what's going on. And that's a huge market, even pre-internet. I mean, that's a huge percentage of every, and in that respect, it's slightly brilliant that you write this book, because there's a lot of people who want to understand it. And I think just if the only thing that you said in your book was, hey, that lie that we blame it on the internet, but it's really corporations. This lie that corporations, because in theory the internet could be different, but the corporations came in and they said you can, and even they've convinced all of the people at the top, the Scorseses I've even heard say, you've got a phone in your pocket, you can write a movie. Now I'm torn because I've been very lucky. I've been able to be a professional artistic person my whole adult life, and but I didn't get like the next level, but I was around a lot of people who did, and to this day I don't know how to suss it out if my argument is just based on my experience, or if you were to look at a different sample size, would you get a different argument?
You're now talking about the sample of 140 people roughly that you interviewed for your book. Yeah.
Right. I interviewed about 140 people, and again, 4 broad categories: music, writing, visual art of various kinds, and film and television. And most of those people were working artists, and some of them were experts of various kinds. Like they were some journalists, some sort of people at the sort of production end, like a music producer, television producers, gallerists, that kind of thing.
It's a really nice blend. You curated it incredibly well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I spent, several years, right? It took me time just to get to the people I wanted to talk to, because I specifically didn't want to like see somebody's name in an NPR story or a New York Times story and contact them. My feeling was if they were that famous, even just that famous, they were already more famous than I wanted to talk to. I wanted people who were working like regular working artists, people who were actually in the arts full time, but just sort of the normal kind of person. But I didn't just do that. I also did a lot of reading. including, as up to date as possible on all the metrics of the economics of the arts. So I'm not just basing it on these people's experiences. I have all kinds of statistics about how much money recorded, for example, how much money recorded music is generating now, and how is that money being distributed? In other words, 80% of it or more is going to the top 1% of acts. And that's true of recorded music. It's actually also true for music performance. So I feel pretty confident that I got it right. And other people have written about this and pretty much concur with what I said. And the artists who I've heard from, also, I think it's pretty clear at this point.
I guess what I'm saying is, as a individual artist, though, you're not going into the art saying like, oh, I'm looking at the macro of it all. You're saying, right, how do I fight my way in? What is my specific, and
that was never that was never the goal of the book. The goal of the book was journalism. Well, right?
But let me say this. There are some goals the question is relevant. So first of all, I wanted artists to understand that their struggles were mainly not their fault. I mean, of course, there's always the issue of talent and of hard work and of where you are in your career. But a lot of artists, I think artists are very isolated, tend to be very isolated from this kind of conversation. There's even a stigma against talking about money in the arts. So a lot of artists really just don't know the big picture at all, and therefore blame themselves. That's number one. I wanted artists to feel like somebody knows what they're going through, and that they should, in a certain sense, let themselves off the hook. Second of all, how do you do it as an individual? Well, the big answer that the book comes out with is everybody does it differently. And the best way to start to think about how you can do it is to just hear a lot of stories about how other people do it, which is why I not only interviewed all of these people, but I have a couple of dozen miniature profiles of people, half a dozen in each of those 4 areas. And I selected those miniature profiles to have as much variety as possible, right? So in music, I have one person who is supporting themselves mainly through performance, and another person who self-published their own music, and another person who did get a big label contract and how that happened, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast that you did on Unspeakable, and just anecdotally, you mentioned that you felt, I think you were genuinely, I don't want to misquote you, and you can speak for yourself here, but the idea that things, either we're boring, or that art today is more boring, or the product is boring, or that we're bored, and so what they're producing for us is boring. And then you also said, and I take a little bit of umbrage with this, you said, I haven't been to a movie since before the pandemic. My question to you, Bill, is why aren't you going to see movies in the theater?
Listen, I don't pretend to be any better than the other schmucks in the audience. I mean, I will say that I'm better in that I try to pay for what I watch and read. And if I like a podcast enough to listen to it a few times, I'll subscribe, etc. I love going. I mean, I love going to movies in the theater, and it's also a pain in the ass, and it's also a little bit of COVID panic.
Yeah.
And it's also, it is more comfortable not to have to deal with all those stupid people who are going to talk, and et cetera, et cetera.
But is that part of what makes that, going to see it, like, let's take a movie for like Everything Everywhere All at Once. That movie is, the last thing it is boring. And even if you were to take that movie and bring it back to the 70s during what you were kind of heralding as like this better time in cinema, it would have blown people's minds. Is the idea that we're not seeing it communally affecting our appreciation? Not that there's not great art being made, but that there's actually so much being made that there's just not a canon, so that we can all kind of agree, oh, this is the stuff we talk about. There's just almost too much good
Yeah.
stuff to kind of collectively be able to make a, like, and even in the 90s, I could make a Big Lebowski reference and a lot of people would get it. Now, if I make a reference, we just watched Severance.
Amazing
It's
show,
just this
yeah.
I
mind-blowingly.
agree. I think Severance is great.
Have you?
And
So,
what's
I have to
fascinating is
say-
that the person who wrote it came out of nowhere. He has no credentials, this guy.
Right, I noticed
Yeah.
that.
but Emma and
It's
I will make
terrific.
the joke about, like, do you know how to make kind eyes, Mark S? And then he tries to give, and it's like this
No
joke.
one's gonna
no one knows
understand.
this,
Yeah.
because
Everything's an inside joke.
no one
these
has
days.
Apple TV, and so they don't, and it's like, oh, I
Right.
don't have that streaming service, so I
So-
can't see that thing.
Well, listen, first of all, so that article that Megan Dom and I talked about on her podcast called The Unspeakable was admittedly provocative. We're all bored with art. And I tried both in the podcast and on the page to say, I understand people are going to disagree, and and I also say specifically, there's undoubtedly lots of great stuff being made, but it's in the cracks, right? Because I think there's a problem where, in order to appeal to the mainstream, you have to make. I mean, people say this about music, like everybody knows what a Spotify song is supposed to sound like. So if you want your song to be successful on the platforms, it has to have a kind of mainstream appeal.
Yeah.
And but but based on my limited experience, and of course in film and television, I'm sure it's much more limited than yours, I don't agree with you that we are enjoying a glut of great content.
Yeah.
I think when I think about great television, I think about the first decade of the century, teetering, sort of thinning out during the second decade. And there's going to be the occasional severance. But I think that actually, and people have been talking about this lately, and this is partly what caused the strike. That business model, which was based on enormous investment by the streaming services before they saw a profit, has now come to an end, and there's a contraction. For example, starting around 2012, I made a list of about a dozen shows like this, but specifically, most of them came out in 2016. There were these auteur comedies. Maureen Bamford had Lady Dynamite, and Louis, High Maintenance, Better Things, Baskets, right? The Zach Galifianakis, really weird. There were about a dozen of them, and sort of Barry and Atlanta are kind of the last of them. They're gone. They're all gone now. I mean, a couple of networks were greenlighting all of these shows, almost all of these shows, and they were giving money to people like Maria Bamford and Zach Galifianakis to do really weird, interesting things. No show that I'm aware of like that has started since whatever Barry and Atlanta started, which was before the pandemic. So I think that era when tons of money was being thrown at creative people to make interesting television is over. It doesn't mean interesting television is over, but that era is over.
But I mean, are people not being bold? I actually think that they are. I mean, there's something for everyone online these days.
Well, it may not be productive for us to have an argument about this, especially because a lot of it will be a matter of opinion, what's bold, what's not bold. But what I can tell you, and I said this in that, is art boring now piece, but I wrote another piece. They gave it a weird name. I think it's called On Not Drinking the Kool-Aid, and it came out in Salmagundi, which is a literary quarterly. Now, I hear from a lot of people, and I pay attention to lots of things that are going on in the arts. And what I've heard across the board is an enforcement of ideological conformity. Now, can you do what you want and put it on the internet? Of course you can. But one of the myths of art in the age of the internet that I tried to bust in the book that we're talking about, In the Death of the Artist, is that the playing field is level, the gatekeepers are dead, and they don't matter anymore. None of that is true. Okay, there's a big difference between getting your show or movie on Netflix and putting it up on your website. There's a big difference between self-publishing your novel and getting your novel published by a big 5 publisher, or shown in a gallery, or so on and so forth. I think anyone who denies that there is a rigid ideological system on the left right now is just not paying attention or not being honest. And it embraces the arts, it embraces academia, it embraces journalism and the foundation world and the nonprofit world. And I hear about people in writing programs. I hear about people in the world of visual arts in various cities, uh, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I'm talking about. And what I said at the very beginning or near the beginning about how you don't have to please the church or the crown anymore. You have to please your niche audience and or the people who might attack you on Twitter. And they're the ones who are enforcing this. And artists, many artists, from what they say, are terrified of saying the wrong thing. I mean, how many books have to be withdrawn from publication? How much cancellation has to happen in the young adult world? How many sensitivity readers do we have to have before people understand this?
And you're saying that this is enforced by a mob? I mean, it's just the Twitter mob? Because, or is it an overproduction of elites kind of thing? Who's enforcing
I think that's a great point. So, I mean, I think the enforcement, a lot of it happens on social media. I mean, everyone is living in this reality, whether they're in the arts now, arts or not. A lot of it happens in sort of more face-to-face spaces, like the writing seminar in an MFA program. A lot of this is not about working for a more just society. It's about competition. It's about elite overproduction. And I've seen this, and I've seen this with people I know. Social justice is a weapon. And it's a weapon that can be used to fight bad power. But when you put a weapon on the table, anyone can pick it up. And people do pick it up in institutional environments to destroy their enemies. I'm not saying most people do this, but you don't need most people. You just need a few people. And the other thing I want to underscore or say is the chilling effect is the really powerful effect. The effect is that everyone is going to try as hard as possible not to get into that situation in the first place. So they're going to be writing or making films or whatever it is they do with their tails between their legs. And it's going to be boring. And it's going to be conformist. And this is one of the big reasons that I think art has become boring now. Not all of it, but most of what we're exposed to. It's terrified. Everyone is terrified.
For the record, just to push back on that, the comedians don't feel that way. Like if you go watch Bill Burr's special that he just put out on Netflix called Live at Red Rocks, I think, it addresses every single one of these issues in a way that is I mean,
the problem is, Nick, but because the problem is though that he can do that because he's already established. It's the guys who are trying to get in. It's the people trying to get in that are just ostracized from some of these. I guess
I'm just
clubs.
Trying to be I don't know, just encouraging the people who are struggling, because I was lucky enough to push through. I came from nothing in middle of Minnesota and, had no connection to Hollywood and was able to eke out a little career and do, and I had a nice life as a result of that. And I just think, because when we were at the summer program, I was there for that. A lot of those women specifically left that talk very depressed, and you gave them some very sober ideas. And it was like one of those things where, like, if you can't teach them to fly, teach them to fall faster, I guess. But
a lot of people who are cocooned by universities just don't get exposed to this idea. And I just, you wrote a whole book about, it was about elite universities, not universities in general. But I feel like from what I've read, a lot of that could be applied to the American university system in general. No.
Yes, I agree. But let me say, and the book, if people don't know, is called Excellent Sheep, and it came out in 2014. I didn't write this book, The Death of the Artist, to discourage people. I understand that people hearing the reality for the first time might be discouraged or depressed. I would say that that's a good first step, right? I mean, you have to know what you're facing. And once you know what you're facing, you can make choices. Do I want to persist with this, or how long do I want to persist with this? And you can take action. What do I need to do to try to put myself in to have the kind of career, Nick, that you've managed to have, which is going to always be hard, but can be incredibly rewarding if you are able to be one of the relatively few people who go into the arts and manage to carve out some kind of career. But you need to know what you're facing.
Yeah, no, I understand that even having a middle class experience is rare. And I'm grateful for even having had that, just because I know I represent, even my small amount of success represents a bunch of people who didn't even, get
That's
any momentum. And those are the people that I want to, be able to talk to with encouragement, even if I'm being naive. I choose, I guess I'm an optimist, but even in the face of all of the horrific things that have happened in the world and happened to me and to my career, and good and bad, I guess I'm trying to pull out, like, it's always been insanely difficult. And for me specifically, pushing through that and figuring something out in the face of that gave my life tremendous purpose and
absolutely.
value.
Absolutely. And I did not write this book to discourage anyone.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say, I'm sorry, I'll give you in a second. I say this to, I hope I said this at Prague, and I certainly say this when I talk to other groups of artists. If you feel the calling, it's not even just that I'm not discouraging you. If you feel the calling, I encourage you to pursue it, but pursue it with eyes open, and pursue it knowing that it might not work out. And in 10 years or whatever it is, you need to have a serious conversation. You may well need to have a serious conversation with yourself where you realize, I need to do something different with my life, at least as my main thing.
Well, I mean, this kind of ties into your book, Excellent Sheep, in the sense that you make the, to me, very surprising point, and one that maybe I would personally disagree with, the way that Nick personally disagrees with aspects of Death of the Artist. This idea that the liberal arts education is in and of itself valuable, even if you end up going into something else. Now, I'm someone who, because I was the university, the daughter of a university professor, it was always kind of assumed that I'd go to college. It was always assumed that I could study something as incredibly silly as opera performance. That's uniquely it's uniquely stupid for reasons, that we don't have to get into. But and there's a particular pain that I still feel now, even as I'm figuring out how to sort of diversify in all this. There's a particular pain to figuring out that this thing that you have poured yourself into, hours of practice, your whole identity, and frankly, talent, because there is talent there. You have to have it. I think music is one of those degrees you just can't fake, unlike an arts, visual arts or degree or something. There's a unique pain.
Good point.
Yeah, you can't. There's just a unique pain to knowing that I had given my youth to something, because not all time is created equal. Your youth is a time where you can learn things and get into a field in a way that you can't later. And these people, and I get very angry when I hear people from specifically the opera industry, but I'm sure there are equivalents elsewhere as well, who say, well, it's okay if you don't make it in the opera world. You can be, this will make you a much better realtor if you want to be a realtor one day. Well, maybe you never wanted, maybe you're an ambitious person who wanted to do something well, something that is prestigious. Maybe you have a brain on you and a work ethic that you, and musical ability, or whatever it is, that these really high level abilities that you have to have in order to pursue these fields. And there's just something that I cannot reconcile about this idea that all of that time that I spent, I should, potentially leave behind. And all of that time that I gave to it in my youth and all that. So I don't know. I mean, it's a statement.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking. It really is. And to a certain extent, this is just life. This is just something that happens in life. To a certain extent, it's deeply unfair in that I feel like more and more we're moving towards a society where the value of what you do is inversely related to your financial rewards.
Bullshit
Right?
jobs phenomenon. Yeah. The bullshit
that?
jobs phenomenon that David Graeber talks about.
Yes, in fact, I just stole that from David Graeber. That's pretty much what he says. But I mean, look, teaching, university teaching, the arts, these are getting financially worse and worse, right? So it's therefore harder and harder to tell a young person, like, yeah, you should major in the liberal arts, you should major in the fine arts, you should go for it. I still insist, like, if you feel a call to do these things, if this is what is going to give your life meaning and make you happy to get out of bed in the morning, you should at least try But, and I say this in Excellent Sheep too, know what the trade-offs are going to be. Don't people talk all kinds of bullshit to the young. You can be whatever you want. No, you can't. It's never too late. Yes, actually, it can be too late. You can, if you just try hard enough or you just want it badly enough. No, no, no. Okay? It's tough out there. But, like Nick, some people manage to get through. And if you're good enough and you care enough, you might want to give yourself that chance. I know that there are people who have the opposite regret. I didn't give myself that chance. And now I'm 40 and it's too late. I'll never be an opera singer. I should have let myself do it. I shouldn't have listened to my parents, whatever it was.
Yeah, but I mean, it's more that, whatever that love and the ability and the hard work is, what is the university's responsibility to be able to use that human potential and mold people that are then able to, exist in the world and add something, because it seems like you're kind of put in front of this binary choice of you pursue a very unlikely dream, and then if it doesn't work out, well, then you have to be part of a system that you may just fundamentally disagree with, part of a company, do some kind of severance like thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because what is the alternative? So, be a realtor, I mean, it's...
Well, here's the thing, and I talk about this in the book, and I could probably talk about it a lot more. In fact, probably you could have a whole book about this. If you need to step off the art path and do plan B, probably the best thing you could do is to try to repurpose some of the skills that you've acquired along the way. And there may be more skills than you realize. And I quote some people in the book who talk about this. Like, actually, you've learned to manage projects if you've, mounted exhibitions or whatever it is. I'm not going to go through the list. It's going to be different for everybody. But actually, I hate that argument, study the liberal arts so you can go be a good asshole, a good banker or realtor.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that it isn't true that by doing these things, you are acquiring transferable skills. And ideally, you're going to be able to figure out a different career that isn't going to just mean going to work for the man and hating your life. But that's also going to be difficult.
I mean, I guess the question that you have to start with is, well, what did you think the value was of what you were doing to others? Because that's, to me, I think it's more important than money than anything else is this idea of purpose, right? Going back to Viktor Frankl, right? And the thing is, you can, even with pursuing your dreams, you can end up in a situation where you realize that you do not have the fundamental need of purpose met in your life because you do not have an outlet for what you're doing. You realize, like me, just what a niche opera is and how the industry works and how small it is and how the pathways work, going into and how basically useless what you've done actually is to most others.
This is a hard thing to hear, and maybe you'll push back on it, but whether it's opera or serious visual art, or quite frankly, the kind of writing that I do, we never had this conversation. We don't need to have this conversation. I don't consider what I do art, but I do consider it craft. And I put a lot of work into my craft, and I get less and less money for it every year. Not literally every year, but the kind of pay that you can get for freelance writing, which is why there's so much crappy writing on the internet, because who's going to put in the time to craft an essay if they're getting so little for it? Well, I will, because this is how I get my pleasure, my fulfillment. I'm older now, I can afford to, and I'm not going to do differently because this is why I'm doing it to begin with. But I recognize that there's not a very large audience for that, or certainly there isn't a very large market for it. There aren't a lot of people who are actually willing to pay. And the same is probably true at this point of opera, of serious visual art, of real poetry, not the kind of stuff that passes for poetry on Twitter. And it's not fair, it's not right. Maybe that means that society, and meaning governments and nonprofits, should support quality work, and to a certain extent they do. That's a big part of how arts like poetry and opera survive. But at a certain point, we also just need to acknowledge to ourselves, like those great TV shows we were talking about, there may be a few 100,000 people in a country of 330 million that want to watch this stuff. Don't think that it's ever going to be a popular art form. Most people want the Kardashians. They want, 2.5 Men or whatever the latest stupid network show is. And that's reality. You can make the greatest buggy whips in the world, but nobody wants a buggy whip anymore.
Well, I mean, but the thing is, saying that, it sounds like the internet would be a great thing because it's allowed niches to form. I mean, that was the big buzzword for, and it still is, this idea that any niche can find its audience. But
that was okay. So, and I talk about this a lot in the book. That was the big promise: the 1,000 true fans. To a certain extent, it was oversold, and the finances weren't going to work. To a certain extent, that's exactly how it works. And so many of the people I talked to and wrote about who are managing to do okay enough, they may be making $30,000 a year, but they're managing to keep themselves going. That's exactly how they're doing it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that just seems to be the only conclusion is the niche.
I mean, and to be very clear, Bill, I find your book and your writing just...
Well, the writing is just superb.
Cogent, and you just, you really, you've created a very valuable product, if for only the very reason that you're helping to dismiss this lie that everyone has some sort of right to be an artist, and it's because of the phone in your pocket. And it's like, no, that was marketing, and we've all been kind of subjugated to that. And at least it was nice to hear someone else be like, no, that's bullshit. And you're like, yes, thank you. I could finally feel like that was this lie. And I just, if for no other reason, thank you for writing the book for that.
Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure. And listen, part of the reason that I insist that I'm not an artist is, aside from my definition of art that excludes what I do, is that not everyone is an artist. And those who are artists have gotten there with gifts that are rare, and a work ethic and a dedication that's also very rare, right? So what I'm trying to say is that it's out of respect for the people who really are artists that I don't call myself one. And I hate that, it's like a human right to call yourself an artist. Not everyone is an artist for the same reason not everyone is an athlete. We are all born with some measure of creative ability, and we're all born with some measure of athletic ability. Very much not the same from person to person in either case. And those of us who dedicate their lives to developing that particular ability become artists and athletes, and the rest of us don't. And that's okay. You're still a valuable human being if you're not an artist.
It's interesting because David Graeber, right before he died, he co-wrote a series of essays called Another Art World with his wife, Nicka Dubrovsky. Were you aware of this? So, she's a visual artist, and this was one of the last things he published. It was a series of 3 essays called Another Art World, and it was talking about really the prolet cult, which was this big social experiment in communist Russia where they tried to basically do something which they would call art communism. And one of the slogans, of course, is everyone is an artist. And the series of 3 essays was trying to support this idea that everyone is an artist. And I think it's, I love David Graeber. I think he'd make some really interesting historical connections between the place of the artist after the Industrial Revolution, for example, that development, all of that. And he traces everyone as an artist, actually, that concept back to Novalis, the philosopher, all the way early Romantic philosopher. Novalis, yeah. He was the first one to kind of express this sentiment, which they argue is actually a romantic, capital R, idea, which then got transformed, kind of taken up by communism. Yeah.
Communism, and go ahead.
No, that's all.
Well, no, I mean, now that you make me think about it, I think that idea also circulated in sort of leftist circles in the 60s.
Yeah.
It was a utopian idea.
Boys. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yes. Ben Davis, that's his name, right? 9.5 Theses on Art and Class. He's a Brooklyn-based art critic and writer, very smart guy. Ben Davis, young guy. He makes that argument in 9.5 Theses on Art and Class. I think that's the name of the book. I don't agree.
Yeah.
But also,
we also don't agree.
We don't agree either.
We also don't agree.
I mean, I wrote about this as well, and I challenged Nicka on this.
But also, one of the horrible ironies, historical ironies of this idea that, yes, began, was the property of the left for a long time, is that because it was in circulation, especially was put in circulation in the 60s, everyone's an artist. It was available for the Apple Computer Company to pick up in the 90s and use as a marketing tool. And that's what it's become now. Because the whole reason that this idea is being put out there is to get you to buy their machines and use their platforms so they can, as you, very nice word you use, they can plunder your creative output.
I guess I'm just realizing that my mom was the direct result of that. And then she had a kid, and she told that kid, if you're going to be a priest, you're going to be the Pope. And, and those ideas are potentially infecting my entire generation.
Well, what's interesting is because I'm half Czech and I went to Czech schools as a kid, I got the opposite messaging, which is the messaging is, you're weird. There's something very wrong with you. You must be an artist. So it was a form of bullying. I mean, it was really a form of bullying, but there's this in Czech thought, which is interesting because we were under Soviet rule for so long. You would think that we would absorb some of the prolet cult ideas, but it's still very strong in the culture, the opposite notion that artists are these weird people off to the side that don't quite fit in. There might even be something wrong with them, actually. They're not normal human beings, but they exist, and it's like some kind of defect.
One of the parts of my book that I think is most important to me and most deeply felt for me, and I think most important for readers, especially young artists, I have that chapter that I'd never expected to write called The Life Cycle, where I mark out the stages of a sort of generic artist's life that are very different from a normal person's life. One of them, and it was just based on patterns that I was seeing in my interviews. I knew from when I was 3 or 5 that this is what I was going to do. Most people don't say that. Most people don't know that. The second part of that is, and everybody tried to discourage me. And I have that wonderful quote, long quote, a paragraph or two from Andy Miller, who's an illustrator and a teacher, who talks about how creative kids are insistently discouraged because they don't fit the model of what the schools recognize as intelligence. So they look like they're either not intelligent or even learning disabled because there are no metrics to identify what's special about them, and certainly no value that's placed on it. The way he put it is, later in my life, he was one of these kids. Later in my life, I was reading books about like Steve Jobs and these 1 in a million creative geniuses, and he's like, that was me and all of my friends. It's just we don't have the means to recognize that talent. So it's kind of like what you said about Czechoslovakia, maybe less formalized, but I think the same messages come through.